Hello, and welcome to this presentation on Spatialising the Moral, a short historical perspective on rape and urbanisation in South Africa. My name is Lisa Vetten, and I'm based at the University of Johannesburg, where I form part of the Gendered Violence and Urbanisation in India and South Africa project. So the starting point for this, or the departure point for this presentation, is these two ways of seeing or of picturing rape in South Africa. The first is a table produced by the police, and it looks at the top 30 stations in the country where the most rape is reported. The second is this map produced by PEPFAR for the DREAMS project, which stands for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored and Safe Young Women between the ages of 18 and 24. This is an intervention implemented in very specific parts of the country that sought to address the reduce and bring down high rates of infection among young women of HIV, and drew a very close link between HIV and rape. And in doing so, created these maps where the program was to be concentrated. What I want to focus on is, how did it become possible to see rape in this way? How did this become a way to picture the problem of sexual violence in South Africa? So I think to begin with, South Africa is a deeply complicated country, and there are multiple histories here. It's also a relatively new country. The Union of South Africa only came into existence in 1910. Prior to that, South Africa was 2 British colonies and 2 Boer republics. And it's with the introduction of the Union that I think segregation and later apartheid came to be most profoundly instituted. But there are earlier models for thinking that provided some of the impetus for segregation. One of these was the sanitation syndrome, coined by Maynard Swanson in 1977. And this drew on emergent thinkings around public health and epidemics, and how you could contain these, and how one should think about disorder being expelled elsewhere. And so one can already see in some of these, between 1870 and 1910, movements of removing people, typically Black or coloured, although those categories weren't really in existence then, elsewhere in order to reduce the threat of contagion. The other impetus this derives from pre-Union are ideas around rural innocence, urban corruption and crime. Here the Black Peril scares between 1870 and 1914 are important. These have been a feature of a number of colonies and have emerged and are based on the isolated incidents of white women being raped by Black men, which then call for great controls, great racialized panic, attempts to confine, do violence to Black men typically, remove them from households, but a great many ways in which racial anxieties around gendered social relations were managed. Of course, generally speaking, the opposite, white peril, white men's rape of Black women, was not something that colonizing societies particularly paid any kind of attention to. Where it becomes important in the case of South Africa is its possible relationship to the 1913 Natives Land Act, which dispossessed Africans of almost all their land, denied them the right to own that, and denied them the right to own property and land, except within the 7% of the country dedicated as reserves for where Black people could live. And so this Sol Plaatje drew quite a clear relationship between these. The other idea was that keeping Black or African people within rural areas was keeping them within their natural, traditional, tribal lives, and that leading those kinds of lives was very good. It reduced the cases of violence. It was only when Black people came into urban areas and lost tribal habits of thoughts and behavior that violence ensued. And this quote here is from a state psychiatrist in 1937, who claimed that on his visit to rural areas, he could not find any incidents of rape, that the only place he could find rapists was men who had been confined to mental institutions. So as far as he was concerned, proof that as long as Africans remained in rural areas, there was no concern. It was only when they came to urban areas and were corrupted that violence emerged. And this linked to other social concerns by the colonial administration, that urbanization also threw together people of all race groups, particularly when they were poor. And as the early part of the 20th century also coincided with urbanization not only of Black people, but of white, colored, and Indian. There was a great fear that as people congregated together, regardless of racial category, into slums, that this was going to create having a very bad influence upon each other. And there were particular concerns about so-called poor whites, which have been typical of a number of colonies, where I think your white administration looks at poor whites, doesn't see them as particularly good examples of white superiority, quite the opposite, and looks for ways to relocate and move them elsewhere in order to commence with the necessary moral, economic, and other training in order to make them better whites. So I think these concerns about both epidemic and crime provided some of the thinking, some of the underlying metaphors for what followed next, and how these ideas then came to be enforced in very particular ways in law. So the founding principle might come from the Stallard Commission of 1922, which stated that a recognized principle should be that natives are only permitted within municipal areas where their presence is demonstrated by the wants of the white population. And this is just a small snapshot, most of it focused on the legislation that sought very specifically to confine and locate Black people within rural areas, make their time in urban areas very difficult, limit their access to housing, to ownership of land, to ownership of property, through things like the Population Registration Act, create firmly in law racial categories of African or Black, white, colored, and Indian, and then through the Group Areas Act, designate parts of the country for the exclusive use of people classified in particular racialized ways. So these patterns of these limitations on movement and confinement were based on both residence, which of course was residence in urban areas very limited for Black people, and was also dependent upon employment. Lose your employment and you lost your urban residence. So this is a very brief snapshot of how prescribed and non-prescribed areas were created, how passes and reference books and other documents were created in order to permit and allow for movement, how areas were set up, for instance, the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which tried to convert the reserves into so-called homelands, separate independent territories or Bantustans, where it was imagined that the majority of the Black population could be confined. This legislation was predominantly accomplished from the 20s and to the 1960s. In the 70s and the 80s, through the Amendment Act, the Development Act, one sees it starting to loosen, first with the introduction of 99-year leases and then freehold. But it's also, as you can see, the loosening of the grip of apartheid and increasing resistance to it, which brings us to the 1970s and the era of the Jack Rollers, and a focus on a particular place, Soweto, which was both a geographical space but also social imaginary, captured, I think, by the 1976 uprising of young people against apartheid, and specifically being taught in Afrikaans. These were very important uprisings that sparked resistance around the country, but they also created what came to be called the lost generation. And this is a group of men specifically, but not only, who created a great deal of unease because their educations had been disrupted, they were unemployed and unemployable. And so there was a perception that what they did with themselves instead was turned to crime. So not coincidentally, 1976 not only sees the result of the other political uprising is also to create unease or an intense focus amongst white administrators on perceptions of how criminality had increased. This came to be focused in the Jack Rollers, who were initially a gang in Soweto whose specific modus operandi was stealing cars, but rape. And so Jack rolling came to be the name applied to any kind of gang rape. And they were extremely frightening figures. The quote at the time from Mary Mbaso explains the fear that people felt, particularly women who were organizing against rape at that time, around the Jack Rollers. But out of the Jack Rollers emerged this other very fearful figure, which was the HIV-infected rapist who sought out the virgin or the child in order to cure himself of rape. Again, coincidence of politics, political, social, and economic is very important here. That the Jack Rollers and the monstrous HIV rapist emerged at more or less the time South Africa began to move towards political transition and democratization. And as so unfortunately happened, this also coincided with the arrival of HIV in South Africa. And so these came together in this particular figure. And with the very rapid increase of HIV in South Africa, given the way so much of its social structures had been blasted and profoundly damaged by apartheid, not least through practices of migrant labor, found very fertile ground in South Africa. And so people saw within the emergence of this particular figure the idea that South Africa actually had two epidemics, not just HIV, but rape. And so I think thinking in this way, once again, drew on very deep roots of public health thinking and how one thinks about epidemics and how one contains them. And so Soweto became the focus of some of the first public health efforts in order to try and address this relationship that was being seen between rape and HIV, where South Africa's high rates of rape were being seen as driving the HIV epidemic, and in turn, the HIV epidemic was driving rates of rape. So emerged these various programs of pastoral power intended to change gender norms and reduce both epidemics at the same time. And hence we get this picture of Dreams, which was launched in 2015 and drew from the Pareto principle applied in relation to AIDS, suggested that 20% of the country accounted for 80% of the HIV infections, and therefore one must focus on those 27 districts that accounted for 82% of all people living with HIV, as well as where most new infections were recorded. And so hence this picture hence this map, this way of seeing the relationship between rape and HIV. And so Dreams was targeted at adolescents, girls and young women between the ages of 15 and 24, and targeted both preventing HIV as well as living with HIV, and had a very strong focus on rape and changing young women's gendered norms. So in a very brief way, I've tried to capture how it is that this way of seeing became possible, drawing on these deep historical roots of thinking about crime, about thinking of epidemic, and the ways these were then consolidated and came together through apartheid and segregation and these laws that sought to control and redesign the entire South African landscape. So in conclusion, urbanization has reconfigured social relations in South Africa in multiple ways that were violent and dislocating. Its logic has been very much that of expulsion, exclusion, and dispossession enacted in racialized ways. And I've made reference to the profound ways in which that has altered the ways in which families and communities could live together. And so one of the other results has been to create a country considered the most unequal in the world, and one where hardship and violence are concentrated very specifically in places of what one could call raw life. I think this history has produced very moralized ways of seeing spaces as dangerous and disorderly, or decorous and respectable, and a geography of rape that continues to bear the structuring traces of crime and epidemic. And so processes of urbanization have produced racialized and gendered controls, even if these may have disappeared at the formal legal level. I think they've produced processes where Black women have moved from confinement to the peripheries or rural areas to incorporation within the urban, from being the subject of exclusion to the subject of improvement and the exercise of pastoral power. While Black men, the position has been somewhat more ambiguous. There is construction that has been both violent, dangerous, and infectious, but also to some extent the subjects of improvement. So I think this history has also created very complex subjectivities and forms of subjectification. So I think which leads to the final point, that gender norms are not formed in the abstract, that being a subject is not something that you come to as an individual. It comes out of these histories that I've tried to sketch very briefly here. And in relation to that, what then become the implications of this history of violence and urbanization for projects like Dreams, which do seek to address urgent and important problems like rape and HIV? Can addressing these be reduced to individualized projects of gendered norm change? And how do hauntings by the past and life within its ruins shape dreams of the present and the future? How do we rethink those dreams differently? So those are my concluding thoughts on this very quick and brief overview, sketch really, of trying to understand how it is that violence and rape in particular has become shaped in such particular ways in South Africa. Thank you.